and I'm doing very little talking, but I would just like to say thank you to Wales Environment Link for facilitating this particular element of the session, which will be looking at how the Environment Act, the legislation that's going through now, have I got the name of the legislation? Environment Bill. Just going through the Senate, I haven't been there for a couple of years, so I'm losing all this in, the lingo of what legislation, bill, all of that, which they can explain to you. The legislation is going through, how that will impact you, and any questions that you may have that you want to engage with on that. So again, thank you to the Wales Environment Link for helping us facilitate this, but also it's really important because it's going through the Senate now, so people need to be aware of what that means and how important it is for your lives on the ground, not only for those who are in the Senate chamber this afternoon. So I'm going to pass over to Edna, who's going to chair this particular session for you here today. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thank you. So my name is Edna and I'll be chairing this panel today. And honestly, I am so glad to see so many of you. Initially, we were feeling a bit worried that maybe we'll be talking to ourselves, but we are so glad. Can you hear me? Yeah. We are so glad that you're here, and yeah. So as I said, I am Edna. I am involved in climate change conversations, so interacting with women and girls in the community to ask them their understanding about climate change, the impact of climate change to human rights, the impact of climate change to women and girls, and just trying to get them involved to engage in this conversation, and hopefully they can do the same in their communities, in their families, and wherever they are. So I shall let the panel introduce myself, so we shall start from my right.
I'm going to try and go to Mike. Can everyone hear me okay? Everyone at the back? Fantastic. Delighted to be here. My name is Ruth Chambers. I work for an environmental think tank and charity called Green Alliance, and we are partnering with Wales Environment Link to try and make this new environment bill, which we're going to talk about today, the best that it can be. I'm based in London, but I work in all of the parliaments across the UK, and I'm from Leith originally. Nice to see you.
Prynhawn da chi gyd. Hopefully you can all hear me all right. My name's Joe Wilkins from Aberystwyth. Here as a sort of passionate ecologist and rights of nature campaigner, hopefully something we can explore a little bit more of, but also, someone who's very interested in how we get people involved in the advocacy part of this bill and how we take it forward and how we make sure that it's as strong as it can be. So I'm really excited to get into it. And a lot of my work at the moment works more with builders and farmers, more on the industry perspective, and seeing how a lot of these smaller, at least the smaller units and smaller groups, are actually very pro-environment. It's the practicalities that we need ironing out. So that's where a lot of my work is centred at the moment.
Prynhawn da. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, that's good. So I'm James Hitchcock and I work for Rewilding Britain. So I work on policy and advocacy. So across Britain we have 1,000 network members. So a combination of private sites, charity-owned sites, undertaking rewilding. And what is rewilding? Well, rewilding is a very powerful and scalable approach to nature's restoration. So it is effectively working with nature rather than against it, and it is restoring natural processes, so re-wetting peat, re-wiggling rivers, and returning key lost species where possible and appropriate, to the point where nature can take care of itself and us again properly, and that we recognise that we are part of nature and embedded in nature, and that we need it to underpin our systems and our future prosperity. So I'm really interested in that high-end, high-ambition part of the conversation, and I'm really particularly interested in getting some really good, solid targets for nature within the forthcoming bill.
Okay, thank you. I will sort of direct the first question to Ruth. So what is the new environment bill? And if you can just explain what the bill is, the framework, the whole work, so that everybody can understand what it's all about before we get into the nitty-gritty of it.
Okay, so to give it its full and proper and somewhat pompous title, just in case that's helpful, it's called the Environment Principles Governance and Biodiversity Targets Wales Bill. So right mouthful, which we're not going to use today, we're just going to call it the Environment Bill for Wales. What is it? Well, it's a bill, so that means it's a set of proposals that will eventually become law once they're agreed by Senedd Cymru. And those proposals will either require Welsh ministers or public authorities in Wales to do certain things, or it will give them the power to do certain things if they want. And that bill was published in June. It already seems a lifetime ago, to be honest, because we've been working on it for such a long time. It's going through the various stages in the Senedd at the moment. Is that what they call stage 1 at the moment, which is the initial stage. And actually tomorrow there's an important debate when the Cabinet Secretary, Hugh Davis, who's the lead in the Cabinet on the environment, is appearing before Senedd Committee, and he's going to be grilled for the last time in this stage on what's in the bill, and then eventually the bill will move through different stages, and we hope it will be passed by April next year. You'll notice that April is very close to the 2026 elections, so yes, this bill has a timetable that needs to be stuck to. Just finally then from me on this question, what's in the bill? It's got 3 main parts. The first part is about something that we call environmental principles. They sound a bit obtuse, but they're really important. And to give you an example of one that really matters for us here in Wales, it's one called the polluter must pay. So generally, if polluters make pollution, the theory and the principle is that they must pay for making that pollution. The bill will enshrine that principle, along with some others, into Welsh law, and it'll also put duties on Welsh ministers to take account of that when they make their policy in the future. There's more to part 1, but that's a little bit of a taster. Part 2 then sets up a new environmental watchdog. Again, it's a bit of a mouthful. It's going to be called the Office of Environmental Governance Wales, or OEGW for short. And this is a new body that's going to replace the oversight that we used to have when we were a member of the European Union. So instead of looking to the European Commission and courts, which we haven't been able to do for several years, this new body will give us, as Welsh citizens, an opportunity to ensure that Welsh ministers are held to account on their environmental commitments. And then part 3 of the bill is about nature targets. And we all know that Wales is one of the most nature depleted countries in the UK, if not the world. This bill won't set new targets, but it will give a framework for Welsh ministers in a future government to set new nature targets. And again, there are duties on ministers that they must do certain things by certain dates, and then there are powers for them to do things as well. So those are the 3 parts of the bill. Part 1, environmental principles. Part 2, this new governance body. And part 3 on biodiversity targets. And we can go into those in a bit more detail as we go along.
So the next question is for all of you to answer, and I'll start with you. So why is the bill important for Wales?
So I think over there on the wall there's a great banner that says deeds, not words. And I think that actions change belief, and we need something that sets a clear pathway to a more nature-rich future, and we need to use that process to articulate how investing in nature and supporting a nature-rich future helps people in their everyday lives. So normal people would benefit. And we can come on to the facts and figures in a bit. But in the case of policy and legislation, you do need to flip that round, and we do need really strong words to drive the deeds, because without them, we're just back in the realm of pledges and pacts and agreements that we continually fail. So at the moment we have a democracy. How deep and how meaningful that is depends on how you analyse it, and we won't go into that now. And we can vote every 4 years now. But in between that, who marks Welsh Government's homework?
Having a legal driver where legal targets that must be met to restore nature are in Welsh law, I think that could be a huge step forward. Secondly, that governance gap. I mean, we've been waiting 8 years for this bill to fill that governance gap, and in the meantime, we haven't had the ability as Welsh citizens to properly hold Welsh ministers to account on their environmental commitments. So it is really important that that is closed at the earliest opportunity. And in fact, we are falling behind our friends and colleagues across the rest of the UK, because the UK government and the Scottish government passed their equivalent bills back in 2021 to close their governance gaps and then put in place the systems and the institutions in the 1 and 2 years following that. So we're already behind, and during this time there has been an interim arrangement. They haven't been very well funded. They've done their best with limited resources. They're known as an interim environmental protection assessor for Wales, but they haven't been able to take legal action where Welsh ministers have not properly given the environment the priority that it needs. I think the third reason, and this is a bit more political, and I make no apologies for that, but we know that Welsh politics are about to change fundamentally. None of us can predict what next year is going to bring, but I think we can all say that there will be major changes, and with major changes comes major uncertainty. So the stronger the direction of travel in law for the next Welsh Government and the next Senedd Cymru to act on behalf of nature, I think the better off as citizens and environment we will all be.
Okay, thank you all. We can give them a clap of hands. Answer. So the next question we're looking at, what does it mean to Welsh people and nature? So the environment bill, what does it mean to Welsh people and nature? And I want to ask you if you can also break it down into the 3 parts of the bill so that the people can understand exactly what it is that they need to understand and hopefully take it forward once they leave here. So I'll start with you, James.
Okay, thank you. So I'll focus on the biodiversity element. So what does it mean for Welsh people and nature? Well, if we look at the bill at the moment, it has some really strong elements in it, but it's not quite ambitious enough. So it has taken the global biodiversity framework, which pledges to see that we ensure that 30% of land is managed for nature by 2030. So that is bearing down on us fast. Currently, the stats say that only 2.1% of land in Wales is in good condition. So we are failing quite abysmally, despite 50 odd years of protected sites and designated landscapes. So we need to think about getting that target in there, which is set to be in there, but then we need to think about what then comes next. So we don't want a framework, we need secondary targets, which currently at the moment are being pledged to be brought in within 36 months. So 2029 for a target in 2030. That is just not good enough. We need something that's interim. But I'm particularly passionate about that 30%. I think that to properly recognise nature, to properly sort of underpin our economy and to properly reset our relationship with nature, we need some land that is primarily managed for nature. But rewilding, conservation, they're not the only solutions. You know, the 70% of land has to continue to produce food, fibre and fuel, and that has to be done in increasingly sustainable ways through nature-friendly farming, changes to our food system, so you're bringing in short supply chain agriculture. And you know, we can only drive that through a good bill. But if we only focus on the 30%, what's the target for the 70%? We really need to look across the border, because Wales is last, as is often the case, and think, well, what are the positive bits of the other legislations that have gone through? And we could do with an abundance target. So you all know the headline facts about nature depletion and the 1 in 6 species, but go back to some broader stats. We've lost 20% of abundance in the last 20 years, 60% of flying insects in the last 20 years. You know, they are the basis of life. You know, food, food we eat, fibre we draw down. And just quickly, I want to just go into there will be, in the election run-up, 2 or 3 distinct flavours of argument against the case for investing in nature. But 30 by 30 needn't be a threat, and is not a threat, because we know from our data at WEL in Britain that proper support and proper committed action for like systems-led and process-led land management approaches has, in England and Wales, led to a 120% increase in jobs on average. In Scotland, that's 400%. And that is the direct opposite of agriculture. So if we're worried about Welsh language, rural communities and coastal communities, let's think about how you structurally invest in nature to address those things. The public pound is precious, so do things that return across the most targets as possible. And there's been some global reports on this, but there hasn't been much done at a Welsh level. I think Welsh Government are thinking about it, but it's sort of 10 to midnight. So like, when we get to the bit about what you can do, let's ask them to do this, because globally, there's a report called the Waldron Report that said to get to 30 by 30 on land and sea, you need to spend $100 billion. A nice round figure, bloody huge figure. But if you do that, you get a 5-in-1 return on that investment. That's pretty good. Most farms spend £3 for every £1 they get back in income. There's a report by McKinsey, big global consultants, that say that if we get 30 by 30 right, we create 30 million jobs in fisheries and ecotourism, and 650,000 new jobs in conservation, which would bring in 500 billion in GDP globally. It would also then sequester 2.6 gigatons of carbon. We'd see a reduction in zoonotic diseases, so COVID and bird flu, which are serious and set to get worse on current trajectories, and we'd see a 2.2 to 2.8 times expansion of endangered species if we get the underpinning systems right. So there's a lot to play for, and we mustn't let this go through as a weak bill.
Thank you for that, James. Joe, do you want to focus on any specific part of the bill in your answer for that?
No, I think I can sort of talk about as well about why I think, as sort of been alluded to, we have been in this limbo for the last 8 years where, you know, some panels have been filling some roles, you know, other organisations have been trying to fill a strange, both regulatory and, it's been a very complicated situation, whereas us as citizens, it's left us with not much agency when it comes to actually standing up for nature across the country. And you know, within the CENEV system, you know, I'm a big advocate that nature needs a stronger voice, and there's different ways around the world that has been done, but at the moment we are nature's voice, and whether that Office for Environmental Governance Wales, OEGW, can help us facilitate that, you know. And I think we've been stuck where I've had community groups. I used to work as a community engagement officer for the Rivers Trust, had groups who know exactly who's doing the pollution, they know exactly who's responsible, but they have felt like there's not really a streamlined process to do it, and then you're sort of met with, am I going to put in the effort as a volunteer to go about all this? So I do hope that it's important for people to feel that sense of agency, that they can stand up for nature and be the voice for nature within the CENEV system. I know there's other ways to stand up for nature, but within the policy and legislative framework, I think we've been lacking that ability to be like, actually, this is wrong, and I want you to take action on this, because we've been in this complicated mess where you go to one department and they say, no, actually, no, that's temporarily held by this panel, then you get passed around, and eventually you just go, I'm not going to do it. And so I hope that it'll provide some clarity on and ability and empowerment for people across Wales to stand up for what they believe in, because as James said, people do genuinely care about nature. It's strongly linked to our culture. I was talking to someone earlier about how the second verse of our national anthem in Wales talks all about the nature of Wales, and how we can't talk about Wales without talking about the streams, the rivers, the trees, the mountains. So it is intrinsically linked to Welsh culture, so I hope that that provides this. The other bit that I wanted to say is I think it's going to be important, and I guess this is where how we communicate this bill with wider public is where it gets important, and how we are up against quite a difficult time in politics and in communications in general. We've got some very strong forces pushing back, and so it's not even just like a passive system that we're trying to change. We have actually got active opposition, and that's where we're going to need to be really clear that this isn't just another piece of legislation to add on to another complicated mess. It does need to be strong, it needs to be clear, and it needs to be workable and support the other aspects of life. And something I wanted to sort of touch on this point is the Global Biodiversity Framework has a target, I think it's target 14, which is my personal favourite of the targets, which says that nature should have all policy decisions should have a consideration for nature in their working. And so that would then open up scope around health, education, so that it's not seen as an additional burden upon governments, it's intrinsic across government. How that exactly would translate, but I hope that this bill again shows that there's a duty and an obligation on Welsh ministers, and so they almost have to work together to achieve this, and that will then open up these avenues that if we treat this just as an environment issue, we're not going to solve it. We need to open the doors for culture, education, health, and I hope having this, not that that's necessarily in the bill, but I hope having the bill facilitates that wider conversation to bring nature in. That's where I'm hoping this will be important for people and nature across Wales.
Great.
So I agree with all of that. I'll go back to part one of the bill, if I may, which is probably the hardest one to explain because it's quite technical, but it is really important. And that's the one you remember that is bringing these 5 principles that used to be in EU law into Welsh law. And I'll just run through what they are. I won't call them by their proper names, but explain what they kind of mean, because they are all really important. And they're all things that you would recognise and think, well, that's just common sense, isn't it? So the first is that you should prevent environmental damage from occurring. Next, if damage does occur, sort it out at the point at which it occurs. Don't let it dissipate or run riot in the environment. Next, the polluter must pay. Mentioned that when pollution occurs. Next is something called the precautionary principle. And that really means just because you may not have all of the necessary evidence or scientific certainty that you need, doesn't mean that you shouldn't act with precaution on behalf of the environment. And the last one is something called integration, which means that the environment and environmental protection should be brought into all other policy. And those 5 principles are the ones that are being brought into law by this bill. So why does that matter for us as people? Why does that matter for nature? Well, it's quite easy, isn't it, to say, yes, we're taking nature into account. Yes, we care about the environment. And sometimes it feels a bit more like lip service than meaningful policy development. But this bill won't result in lip service. It will place a legal obligation on Welsh ministers in the future to have what's called special regard for these principles. So they can't ignore them. They're going to have to build them into almost all policy making. And that policy making could range very widely. It could be about the economy, could be about transport, could be about very Wales-specific challenges like contaminated land. And when Welsh ministers are thinking about these issues, they're going to have to base their policies on these environmental principles. And if we think that they aren't, and if the new body, the OEGW, thinks that they aren't, then we can make that challenge in a way that we can't now. So that's why I think the environmental principles will really matter, because they will bring the environment back into its really rightful place at the heart of policy making, where it's drifted over the past few years. Just to add to the comments about OEGW, which I think were just really spot on, what I think that will do for us is it will restore our rights and our voice as Welsh citizens. Of course we still have those. Of course we haven't lost our voice. And we exercise that, and that's really what you're all doing, here today, and have been doing for a really long time. But it's all very well us speaking out and making noise when we don't like what the government is doing. It's much, much better if we do that alongside an independent statutory body that's been set up for the sole purpose of holding this government and future governments to account on environmental law. And we know from our experience in England, Northern Ireland and Scotland, that raising our voice alongside that statutory body has led to much stronger outcomes than if it was just us doing it alone. 3 reasons why we want to improve this bill, but actually they're the same 3 reasons why, when often we work on bills, we want to look to strengthen them. One is about durability. This bill is going to last a long time. When it becomes an Act of Senedd Cymru, it's hopefully going to last for a very long time. And at the moment, some parts of the drafting are, let's just say, a little bit flimsy. That's not, I don't mean to be rude by that, because it's really hard to write legislation at pace, which is what the Welsh Government's been doing. But there are ways in which this bill can be more durable for the long term. And I'll give a couple of examples in a minute. Another one is clarity. So, if you and I looked at the bill and came to a different meaning or an interpretation, it's not clear enough. And there are some examples of ambiguity in the drafting that we'd like to see tidied up. But I think the most important thing that we're looking to achieve from our suggestions for ways in which the bill can be strengthened is to compel action. Again, going back to that point where none of us know what the government is going to look like in the future, we want this legislation to really compel action regardless of the sort of government we get. So a couple of examples then, one from part 1 and one from the OEGW. So part 1, that section on environmental principles. I've mentioned what the 5 principles are. It's going to be a duty on the Welsh Government to take them into account when it makes policy. What's policy? What policy is going to be included? Welsh Government say it's quite a broad definition, and it's any policy that could or might have an effect on the environment. That's not all policy, and we worry that that could be open to some loose interpretation in the future. We think it would be better and safer to include all policy within that part of the bill. And then turning to part 2 on the watchdog, the OGW, the biggest thing that this bill doesn't do, in fact it doesn't say one word on it, is protect the independence of this body. And it must be a properly independent body, because as soon as it starts to do its job, it's going to be finding fault with Welsh Government. That's its job, is to monitor what's going on and to call out areas where the Welsh Government could be doing more, could be going faster. So it needs to be at arm's length, at proper arm's length from the government. There's no provision to protect it in the bill. There are simple things that could be done. You could put a duty on Welsh ministers to have regard to the body's independence. You could also make sure that the body will be governed by a board of members. Who's going to appoint those members? It's going to be Welsh ministers. So you could put some safeguards in there for oversight by the Senedd. And then where's the money, where's the resourcing for this body going to come from? It's going to come from Welsh Government. Again, that could be done in a different way. Resourcing of bodies like Audit Wales and the Public Ombudsman for Wales are done in a more independent way. So there are lessons that we could learn there.
Yeah, not too much to add. I think the question around the wording, as someone who's sat in a few policy rooms and they've spent days discussing whether a sentence should say can, shall, would, will, could, you start to realise that yes, it sounds to an outsider it does sound like, oh, they're just going round and round in circles, but the wording that is chosen places very different obligations on the people that it's talking about, and so even that sort of wording, it needs to be addressed as well, because they'll place, say if something should do something, it's like, oh, I think if something will do something, if something can do something, and these are very different words that will translate into how that thinks. The other thing I wanted to touch on is, I think we're seeing at the moment around the world is these arm's length bodies that have been set up have come under attack in many countries around the world, one in particular, where they're nominating people, and having the integrity and the independence secured from the outset, I think is crucial, because otherwise what we see is essentially political appointees which will not actually deliver on the thing. So that's why the independence needs to be ensured from the very start, and sometimes we have a habit of creating legislation and then trying to fix it. And I think we need to be very proactive at ensuring that independence, just from a look around the world, that having it in place now is in place from the very outset. That's the only things I had to add, is that the wording, even right down to individual words chosen, can be a massive impact on how a legislation comes together, and then how we can use it as citizens to protect nature.
I'd like to ask you, do you want to give us example of the wording so that people can understand exactly what you mean?
The one that I can think of, it's not a Welsh specific one, but just an example I can think of is, I used to work more at the UN level, and we had the plastics treaty signed, or the, I can't remember what the word is, well, it was the sort of, they had a meeting to say that they wanted to then have another meeting to set up a treaty. But that first meeting had words in it. They were going through the treaty about what it could look like. And it was the sentence was around countries from the global north would support countries from the global south. And that was where there was big discussion around will, because if it was global north countries will support, it placed an obligation upon them. It was, the other ones were pushing for like can. And it was like, well, if they want to, they can. Or the other ones were pushing for should or shall, because it was like, well, in the middle. And that was just a point I wanted to make, that sometimes legislation feels like it goes round and round in circles, but these words do matter, because they will massively impact how powerful these bodies will be. Like I said, that's not a Welsh, there probably are Welsh specific ones, and I'm sure, and you probably talk about some as well, but that's the one I think of where even down the wording now needs to be tight, because otherwise you're sort of stuck in this battle of trying to improve it and trying to fix it post signing, and then you're down a bit of a rabbit hole again. So trying to get it as right as we possibly can and as strong as we possibly can from the outset is very important. But yeah, words do matter, especially when there's bilingual as well. You've got to throw that in as well. So yeah, that's another one.
Okay, so I guess that should be on top of your takeaway, looking at the words of the bill. Okay, on to the next question. How can you help make it better for Welsh people and nature? So how can you, the bill, make it better for the Welsh people and nature? I can ask whoever wants to go first.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say is like exactly what we've been doing today is meeting with your MSs, meeting with candidates. Obviously, with the election coming up, there's going to be, even if they're not in the Senate in the term that this will be signed, you know, there's political pressure going around it, but definitely talking with your MSs, and also trying, even if you don't count yourself, I think there's still a big debate about, you know, whether you count yourself as an environmentalist, whether you count yourself as an activist, whatever your focus interest is, you know, this bill can have an impact. So even if you're coming from a health perspective, you know, don't be afraid to bring this conversation in about actually placing a duty upon Welsh ministers to deliver nature restoration, you know, to environmental principles, the one around sort of including it in all policies. You know, don't feel like you have to just be nature focused. There's huge scope within this to show that there's more appetite than perhaps seems in a room. If you know, if we just went as NGOs, it might be a smaller group, whereas if you can talk to them and say, actually, I'm very interested in a health perspective, and I think this is really important that we get it right, so that they see there's wider support from different groups. Is something that I work a lot with a group called UK for Nature, and that's something we're bringing in a lot, is this more holistic view of how nature supports communities, and how, again, going back to the issues around social justice, you know, there's a lot of these core underlying principles that this bill is at least seeking to address that are also undermining health, education, safety. So don't be afraid to bring them in. That's more of my advocacy role. You know, don't be afraid to speak up on this bill, even if you're not an ecologist or a policy maker, because every time they hear it that it matters, it's important to us.
And there's a key date for your diary, which is the 11th of November, and that's when the bill will be debated in plenary at the end of this stage 1 of the scrutiny process. So in theory, any member of the Senate can speak in that. So the first thing you could helpfully do if you're engaging with your local MS is to tell them about that debate, to ask them to speak in it, to explain that you think that this bill is a good thing and is important for the Welsh environment and for the people of Wales. And in particular, if you have a Conservative member of the Senedd or a Plaid Cymru member of the Senedd, they would be especially important to speak with, because after the by-election in October, they may hold some sort of balance of power, and the Welsh Government may need their help, it will need their help in getting this bill through. So making sure that they are on side, and remember this bill has had cross-party support, but politics can be a fickle business, and by-elections can produce peculiar results. So especially concentrate on your Conservative and your Plaid Cymru members if you have them.
Just 2 quick points. I think there's a whole bunch of stuff that you guys are really familiar with, like, you know, support your ENGO of choice, sign petitions that are bound to come around. But do remember that numbers matter, and that in Wales, relatively small numbers of people contacting MS and ministers can shift the dial. You know, you need 100,000 signatures in Westminster to get serious notice. 5,000 will really get you some attention in Wales. And think about the power of stories. You know, there will be lots of guidance on the policy information, but think about the future of Wales that you want. Think about what worries you and write to MS. And don't be afraid to invite them out. You know, if anybody wanted to take their MS to a nature-rich site, get in touch with me, and we've coordinated events. It's quite powerful when constituents contact MS. You often get a different response, and then we can curate something, because seeing is believing and actions change belief, and that really helps.
Just what you said about it needs to be taken seriously as climate change. I must say, when I started looking into it, I was just like, environment, climate change. I don't know why in my head I was thinking it's the same thing. Yes, there's an element, it's the same thing, but the more I was looking into it, it's like there are separate things that need equal importance and focus, and the voices to be elevated. So
I think if I just add a little bit earlier, if you were here for the speeches, there was a lot of talk about what politicians think of the environment. People went to litter and things that are reported. What about the underpinning systems? And then, you know, Anthony talked about social justice and the fact we need social justice to have climate justice. What about nature justice? Like, we are part of nature, and we forget that at our peril, really. And that's a more philosophical point. But the bill, and it is a mammoth bill, and in bits, really boring. Like, it's like really vital that is strengthened to get those philosophical and spiritual elements within that.
yeah, no, that's true.